Scientists at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration have reported that about 8 million tons of plastic waste enters our oceans each year. Imagine every month, 2 Empire State Buildings packed with plastic being dropped into the sea. And this isn't a new phenomenon. This worldwide disregard for the environment has been happening for more than 70 years, and it's poised to only get worse. In 2019, global manufacturers made 368 million tons of plastic. That's the equivalent of almost 1,000 Empire State Buildings filled to the brim. Looking ahead, scientists predict that plastic production will double within 2 decades and even quadruple by 2050. From containers to cutlery to plastic bags, it's no secret that single-use plastics are convenient and cheap solutions for many everyday tasks. But the true cost of these products is not immediately apparent, leading many Americans to use a wide variety of plastics and just assume that they're automatically recycled.
The plastics industry has spent a lot of time and money and lobbying efforts on making us feel like if we see that chasing arrow symbol, that the packaging is recyclable, and as long as we put it in the bin, everything's going to be just fine. But that's really not the case.
That's Jenny Romer, an attorney, environmental activist, and the author of Can I Recycle This? A Guide to Better Recycling and How to Reduce Single-Use Plastics. Today, only 9% of all plastic that's ever been produced has been recycled. This is because much of the resin material is so low grade that it's not profitable for local municipalities to break it down and sell it on the commodities market.
Right now, manufacturers are not financially responsible for recycling, the cost of recycling and disposal and cleanup of their products. That's something that I've been working on. I'm an attorney at the Surfrider Foundation. We work on plastic reduction and recycling policies. And something that we're starting to see more and more of now are policies, bills that would require producers, those manufacturers, to pay for those costs rather than having that burden fall on your local jurisdiction, your city, and ratepayers and taxpayers to pay for the cost of recycling. And if we saw producers having to pay for it, we would see an incentive for producers to make their products out of recyclable materials and to see a lot of source reduction.
But currently, this is not the case. Once reaching a recycling center, a large majority of food containers, food wrappers, bottles, bags, and more are deemed unrecyclable and head directly to waste management. Romer has visited many different recycling plants across the country, from basic hand sorting centers to state-of-the-art facilities. And she encourages people to take a tour of their own local center to get a better idea of where their trash ends up. Romer lives in New York City, where the facilities near her are designed to quickly sort the incoming metal, glass, and plastic.
They use a lot of different technologies, including optical sorters, and I like to think of them as kind of lasers that are pointed at plastic containers, and they're actually cameras, and they can tell what type of plastic resin each container is made out of, and shoot that container into an appropriate bin using an air gun. And then once that bin is full, they can be turned into bales, kind of like a hay bale of material, of one type of material, and that's then sold on the commodities market.
So what are the types of plastic that can be recycled and reused? Romer notes that the answer lies in the numbers.
Not all plastics are created equal. So with number 1 and number 2 plastic resins, the numbers that are within the little chasing arrow symbols on packaging, the lower numbers are more recyclable than the higher numbers. So plastic milk bottles and plastic water bottles, those have a market demand. There's a buyer at the other end who wants to buy those types of plastics. But a lot of the other plastics, the number 3 through 7s, those don't have a consistent buyer. And when something doesn't have a consistent buyer, those are going to go to landfill or incineration.
So the next time you're about to throw an item into your blue recycling bin, look at the number listed in the triangular arrows at the bottom of the package. Romer says that in the U.S., for the most part, the lower value plastics, ranging from 3 to 7, end up being sent off to landfills either here or abroad.
Landfills are designed as kind of tombs. They aren't really designed to have products and packaging degrade in landfills. They're supposed to get compacted and stay there forever. And so the Federal Trade Commission regulates what can be said about recycling and composting and biodegradability. And the Federal Trade Commission says that companies should not claim that their products biodegrade in landfills, because that's really not the point of landfills.
Aside from domestic landfills, the U.S. has a long history of shipping more than half of its plastic waste to China and other developing countries. Kate Melgis is all too familiar with this process. Melgis is the plastics project leader at Greenpeace USA, a nonprofit organization focused on environmental activism. She says that the majority of these nations are ill-equipped to properly hold the waste, and much of it ends up littered throughout beaches, coastlines, and in rivers. From there, it eventually drains into our oceans. One example is the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, a floating island of litter located in the central Pacific Ocean that's roughly twice the size of Texas. While this pool of garbage is massive, scientists say it represents just a tiny fraction of the total trash currently in the ocean. So, where does the rest end up?
Most of the plastic that enters into the ocean actually ends up sinking to the seabed. So they found plastics as deep as the Mariana Trench. I think about 1% of what is actually in the ocean is on the surface and floats, and that just happens to do with density and what's heavier than seawater, and a lot of it ends up sinking.
Late last year, a new report by CSIRO, Australia's national science agency, estimated there to be anywhere from 9 to 16 million tons of microplastics embedded on the sea floor. Compare this to the massive visible size of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which holds only 87,000 tons of trash. Much of this plastic will never fully decompose and will break down into microplastics that wreak havoc on the environment.
Animals are eating it. They mistake plastic for food. There's fish that take bites out of plastic. I can't tell you the number of bottles and plastic trash that we've found in the ocean that have bite marks taken out of them from fish and turtles and all sorts of different animals. We've all seen the videos and images of dolphins and whales washing up on shores with bellies full of plastic. We've seen images of birds feeding their young plastic, and birds that are dying or that are dead in their skeletons, and you can see plastics and where their stomach used to be.
Microplastics may not be as visible as a floating plastic bottle, but scientists have found evidence of these tiny shards causing problems all across the world's ecosystems.
We're finding plastic in the air that we breathe. They found plastic at the top of the Rocky Mountains, the top of the Alps, microplastics, and it's in the water that we drink and the seafood that we eat. So it's not only just a crisis for marine animals and wildlife in our oceans, but it's a health crisis for everyone. Plastics contain chemicals that are known to be harmful to human health, so endocrine disruptors and carcinogens, and ingesting them increases our exposure to these harmful chemicals. And we're just starting to look at what that does to human health. But there are toxic chemicals that are known to cause reproductive issues and cancer and respiratory issues.
Plastic pollution has a clear correlation with negative effects on our environment, food sources, and even human health. With this information in hand, what's being done to curb single-use plastic consumption and decrease the amount of waste seeping into oceans? Romer says that one way governments are tackling this problem is by offering incentives to manufacturers who engage in sustainable practices and produce higher-grade plastic that can be recycled and reused.
A policy that they call EPR, or Extended Producer Responsibility, that shifts the responsibility for recycling and waste disposal to the manufacturers and incentivizes them to have more recyclable, more sustainable packaging, and ideally to shift to refill and reuse rather than just single use. And so hopefully incentivizing that infrastructure that we need in order to do things like have refillable beer bottles and milk containers and things like that. And even things like shampoo and cereal, being able to go to a store and not just kind of a crunchy health food store, but a really mainstream store to buy everything that you need without having to pay for that extra packaging.
Romer points out that while policy, law, and international cooperation are big factors, individual actions also matter. Become familiar with what items your local recycling plant accepts, and don't forget to rinse out plastic, glass, and metal before dumping it into the blue bin. Also, make sure to keep bottle caps and lids attached to items. When outside the house, make an effort to be more cognizant of what you consume. Next time you order takeout from a restaurant, opt out of the cutlery and extra plastic. When you're at the store, try to buy less cheap plastic items like water bottles, single-use containers, and plastic bags.
A lot of us learned the 3 R's, reduce, reuse, recycle, but most of us just pay attention to the recycle part. So I really support refill and reuse as much as possible. And so when you're at the grocery store, if you have the option to buy from a bulk bin rather than buying something from a store shelf that is covered in packaging, that's a great option. Or if you can buy your milk in a reusable glass container rather than buying it in plastic or one of the paperboard cartons, that's a really great option. But unfortunately, a lot of us don't have those options locally. So, making those personal choices whenever you can, but also working, supporting policies that would incentivize companies to shift towards the reuse refill models to make those much more widely available than they currently are.
The shift to sustainability is difficult, but it's a necessary adjustment in order to ensure that future generations live in a world that's not littered in plastic. To learn more about this topic, our guests, and get links to environmental legislation on plastics, visit viewpointsradio.org. You can also read Jenny Romer's new book, Can I Recycle This? A Guide to Better Recycling and How to Reduce Single-Use Plastics, available online and in bookstores. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. I'm Gary Price.
Welcome to today's Book Minute, brought to you by Booktrib.com, the leading source for book news and reviews. Celebrated novelist Mike Bond has been called one of the 21st century's most exciting authors. His new historical epic, America, is the first of a 7-book series that relives the last 70 years and our nation's most profound upheavals since the Civil War, a time that defined the end of the 20th century and where we are today. Book 1, America, opens in the shadows of World War II and Korea and ends in the late 1960s, a decade that shook America to its foundation. President Kennedy's assassination, the tragic and unpopular Vietnam War, the battle for civil rights and women's liberation, a cosmic clash of riots and burning cities, and an explosion of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Through the wild, joyous, heartbroken, and visionary lives of 4 young people and many others, the 60s come alive again. America by Mike Bond is available now at bookstores everywhere.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.
Coming up on Viewpoints.
I think in the long run, these people are going to disappear and Dogecoin will fall about 99% lower than it is today. It's just a question of when that's going to happen.
Inside the world of cryptocurrency. Then,
I think there's still kind of a taboo around talking about money, and it's shifting, but we aren't quite there yet.
The touchy conversation of money management. I'm Marty Peterson.
and I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.